My friends and I wanted to spice things up a bit in the upcoming Halloween, and what we did merely for the thrill had caused an inexplicable terror that forever haunted everyone's memories. We lived in an isolated town at the boondocks. The people couldn't care less for holidays since they were always caught up with their daily chores. Due to the lack of resources and enthusiasm from the townsfolks, our previous Halloween experiences were all bland and easily forgettable. In order to change this, my friends and I had decided to do something very stupid and reckless. We only realized that it was a very bad decision when things got out of hand and chaos unfolded to the entire town. There was a rumor in our cemetery about a particular grave that was covered with a steel cage. The old stories claimed that this person was buried alive when she was accused of being a witch, and the cage was placed there to prevent her from coming back to life. We didn't really believe in this tall tale, but we wanted to give the people around us a good scare. Few days before Halloween, we started dismantling the cage, which wasn't that hard to do since it was already heavily rusted and brittle. And on the night of the said holiday, we decided to go a little bit further and dug out the grave as well. We then discovered that some parts of the tale could be true. The remains of the person was not properly kept in a casket. It appeared that she was indeed buried alive. Along with the bones, there was a book which she tightly held on to even to her death. Out of curiosity, we took the book with us and left the grave wide open. We intended to have the townsfolk discover the open grave by themselves and stir things up around our boring town. As we were thinking of a good scary story to spread across our neighborhood about the witch in the grave, we skimmed through the book that we found. The contents were mostly illustrations of sigils which we knew nothing about. The rest were verses of a different language but were written with Roman letters. As we fooled around and tried to read some of the lines aloud, it was when the real horror began. All of a sudden, the moon and the stars disappeared from the night sky as dark clouds loomed over the entire town. An eerily freezing breeze sent chills down our spines, and the wolves in the woods began to howl. We went outside to see what was going on, but our line of sight was dampened by a thick fog that enshrouded the land. The townsfolk were alarmed, and they gathered on the street. We didn't realize that it was our fault until we heard a scream coming from the graveyard. Someone finally discovered the witch's grave that we dug out. My friends and I were sneering behind the crowd until she mentioned that the bones of the witch were missing. We were absolutely certain that we left her remains and only took the book. The people began to panic, and we couldn't admit that we were the ones who dug the grave since we would be in big trouble. We were just a bunch of bored kids who didn't know any better. We only wanted to experience some thrill for the Halloween, but things escalated far worse than we had imagined. The town's mayor ordered the citizens to gather at the hall and discuss the issue at hand. The folks voiced out their opinions about the disappearance of the witch's remains. Some had thought that the bones were taken just to scare them. However, this could not explain why the town was suddenly covered in darkness and enveloped in fog. The others who strongly believed in the paranormal claimed that the witch went back to the surface to exact revenge. My friends and I felt guilty for what we did. While we were deciding whether we should confess or not, the discussion was interrupted by a townsfolk who frantically came running in. He claimed that a shadowy figure tried to get him by imitating his mother's voice, who already passed away. This made the paranormal believers panic even further, while the ones who were trying to come up with a logical explanation claimed that the fog was playing with his imagination. However, this conclusion was proven untrue when some of the folks walked out of the hall. It was hard to deny or reject the existence of an inexplicable entity when it was standing right in front of you. Amidst the fog that surrounded the hall, we saw the shadow people with our own eyes. They were just standing still, right there with a piercing glare, while the residents ran back inside the hall screaming. Few moments later, some of the folks started hearing the voices of their dead loved ones, and those who badly missed their family members who passed away were deceived. Unfortunately, one of them was my mother. I tried my best to hold her back, but she aggressively lashed out of my restraint. She and the few others ran towards the fog and disappeared. Out of desperation, I confessed what we did to the witch's grave and asked for their help. Unfortunately, they were in no condition to listen to my plea. They locked us up in a room. The town was in turmoil, and everybody was on edge while trying to put all the blame on us. I was in no position to argue since they were right. To make matters worse, another paranormal entity from old folklores decided to appear. After a couple of hours since my mother's disappearance, we heard a subtle sound of growling from the fog. From inside the hall, we took a peek from the window and saw a black smoke emanating from a fire. The growls grew louder, and the fire began to take the shape of a large hound with glowing red eyes. And unlike the shadow people who remained within the fog, these hounds made of fire had decided to crawl out of it. Screams of terror echoed around the hall once again as the hellhound revealed itself. The town's mayor ordered the citizens to jump out of the window and run towards the chapel as fast as their feet could take them. The wooden door of the hall were turned to cinders within just a few seconds as the hellhound approached. If it was to enter the building, it would reduce the entire hall to ashes. The town's folks rushed towards the chapel. Fortunately, the town's mayor made the right decision. The giant hound could not enter the chapel grounds while the folks were praying together. I used this opportunity to run towards the fog and look for my mother with my friends. However, the things we saw in the fog were not what we were looking for. Within the thick white haze, there were countless souls coming from the graveyard. It seemed that we did something that disrupted the spiritual world, and the beings from there were pouring into our town. We realized that everything started when we dabbled with the book that we stole from the witch's grave. We went back to my house to get the book in hopes that the means to stop this horror would also be in there. Unfortunately, we couldn't figure out what to read from the contents of the book. We were afraid that recklessly reading a phrase aloud might make things much worse than how it already was. We decided to take the book with us and hand it over to the adults. However, we came across someone which we least expected to see while we were wandering within the fog once again. There was a lady in her early 40s who looked quite different from the other spirits that we previously saw, and she seemed to be looking for something. This lady turned out to be the witch from the grave herself, but she didn't look as frightening as the stories made her out to be. She was relatively calm, and she called us when she saw me holding her book. Apparently, she climbed out from the grave on her own to get her book back. She was able to return from the dead when we intervened with the spiritual world by reading from her book. She knew how dangerous it might be if it would end up with irresponsible people like us, and so she carried it to her grave when she was buried alive by the people who were afraid of her knowledge. We handed it back to her, and she led the wandering spirits back to their resting place by reciting a chant from it. The lady was not a witch, but a medium, and her role was to guide lost souls and keep the other entities from the spirit world in check. The shadow people and the hellhound were able to cross between worlds because of what we did, and we deeply regretted our actions. Little by little, the spirit medium fixed the mess we made. The dark clouds that cast a looming shadow eventually disappeared along with the fog that enveloped the land. When we were finally able to see more clearly, and we found my mother and the other townsfolk lying unconscious on the ground, thankfully, they were safe. We told everything that happened to the town's mayor, and we volunteered to give a proper burial for the medium who saved us. We gave her a proper tombstone and threw away the steel cage. Even though things went out of control, this night was indeed a Halloween experience that we would never forget.